What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today's video we're going to be lowering the rear on a 70 Beetle. So it's got the IRS suspension, which is the independent rear suspension. These came out, I believe, around 69.70 and up on the Beetles. Previously it was a swing axle, which we already did a video on that before. So on this one we're going to be putting just re-indexing the plates in the back so that it's going to be lowered a little bit to match the front of this car. And what's really cool about this is you could do this for basically $0, except for maybe a set of bushings if you want to upgrade them or replace them while you're at it, and then throw everything back in, check out the ride height of your car. Hopefully you got it right. If you didn't get it right, well, guess what? You win the chance to redo it all over again. But this time you'll have practice doing it, so maybe you'll do it faster. Maybe this video will help you. Let me know in the comments below if it helped you out, if you've done it before, and if there's some shortcuts that I may have missed in this video that would have showed people how to do it quicker. The last thing is, this video ran a bit long. I tried trimming down as much as I could in the stuff, but I didn't want to leave too much detail out. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you guys are subscribing. I want to thank all those that subscribed to our channel. All the new subscribers, welcome. And also comment below, give us a thumbs up if you liked it. If I made a mistake or you would have done something different, let me know in the comments below, and we'll see you on the next one. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do to remove the IRS swing axle over here in this process is, what I'll do is we'll remove the bump stop to begin with while everything's solid, so you're not wrestling with it. We're going to also cut this bump stop. We're going to remove 1 inch off this bump stop because we're going to have the travel will come up, so we don't want to bottom out prematurely with the bump stop being too long. So we're going to take 1 inch off of this and then reinstall at the end. Next, what I want to do is I want to crack loose all the bolts on the cover here. I'm going to crack loose and remove the shock, top and bottom bolts. I'm also going to take the axle joint, the CV joint, unbolted at the flange at the drum. And then we're going to start to also loosen up the 4 bolts that hold the rear suspension arm to the swing axle plate or the spring plate, and get those all loosened up. So the important thing over here is going to be to make sure none of these bolts are going to snap or break. Now if you're doing this, there's different ways to do it. You can get the tool that hooks onto here and then allows you to pull this up. We don't have that tool. It was back order. I wanted to get one just for the video to show you guys, but there's different ways of doing that with the taking the tension off this spring plate, so we'll show you what we'll do on that one. Okay, so I'm going to start by cracking these guys loose. I don't like to use power tools when I get started on these, just because I don't want it to... Oh yeah, that's tight. Jesus. We don't want to break these guys because that's a world of misery. Oh yeah, we're going to have to get some more leverage on that. Let's see what we got. Again, you want to feel the bolts loose, and you really don't want to force these. If you feel like they're about to snap, stop. If you don't have experience, get someone that does, or you may want to spray some penetrating lube from the back. You can kind of see where the bolts come out the back side of the frame if you look carefully. So we're lucky on this one. So I'm just gonna loosen it up a little bit. And then we're gonna, now that that's loose, I'm gonna move on to loosening the bolts on the axle. If you guys come over here, there's the bolts right back here. There's about 6 of them. They're gonna be either hex or Torx, depending on the car. So we're gonna undo those, and then we're gonna cover the drive shaft with a bag so it doesn't get dirt into the grease. Again, on this one you want to be sure that you crack the bolts, and you may need to have someone press on the brakes or hold the drum when you do this. And make sure that anything with a hex or Torx, you don't have any debris inside the screw head, because you may have a chance of stripping it out, which then again is a miserable ordeal. And ask me how I know. Jeez. There's one giving us a hard time. So what we do, put a bolt in the wheel here. Put a bolt in the wheel here. Help us out. Take a pry bar. So now the wheel is going to want to turn like that. So I'm going to put my pry bar like this. And we can loosen it up. There we go. Just be careful not to hit yourself in the face with your pry bar. Okay, again. There we go. If your handbrake's hooked up, you can also use the handbrake to help you guys out. So we're going to loosen those up, get those out. Might as well remove the drive shaft right away. And what we're going to do, get yourself some kind of bungee, tie it to the frame back here, and get it ready so that you can catch your axle when you're done. And then get yourself a bag. Get yourself a bag as well to cover the end. Alright. Now we can zip these guys out. Get this guy out of our way. All the boots are loose. Now we got our shaft taken out. So now what we want to do, take a clean bag, which we'll place over here. We'll move this lamp. We're going to put the bag over the axle. Just like so. And then we're going to tie the axle off just out of our way, like so. Alright, so the axle is tied off, and you can run the cord like so. Alright, next thing we're going to do, we're going to loosen those bolts over here, crack these guys loose. These are going to be a 19mm. We've got 4 of them to loosen up. I'm just going to crack them loose first, and then we'll take them out after. Alright. Okay. These guys are stuck in there too, so we'll get a bigger bar. Bigger bar. Alright. Again, you want to make sure you're on there hard. Pull him. Alright. just a few turns. Same with that guy. We're just going to break the corrosion a bit. Then we'll get a wrench in the back of there, and then hold the back side. There. So we've loosened them a bit. Now take a wrench in back. Let's loosen up the cap. Alright, get your bolts out. These should all come out nice and smooth. If you're struggling with these, then you want to take it easy. You don't want to break these bolts or strip them. So 3 out of 4 out. Leave the best for last. One up in the corner here. Alright, that guy's out. Last bolt. We're going to now loosen up the shock, which I believe is a 17 if I'm not mistaken. Don't try and work against the shock. If the top bolt doesn't come out, undo the bottom bolt, get it loosened, and then you can try and work the top bolt. If it doesn't come out, you may have to spin it a little bit. This one may be stuck in the paint a little also. So I spin it and I push from the back. Now let's go. And now we've got the shock coming out. Let's put this bolt down. Alright. There we go. Shock is done. I've already loosened the handbrake inside the car in case we want a bit of extra slack. And then we're going to finalize taking this out. I'm going to drop the car closer to the floor so that we'll be able to support this over here once we've disconnected it from the spring plate. And then we'll work, we'll take the fender bolts out now, and then we'll work the spring plate off its ledge over here. So let me loosen up the fender bolts first, and then we're going to drop it down, and we're going to get the spring plate unloaded. Okay, so now we got to take out the bolt that holds this to the running board, holds the fender to the running board, to remove the bolts over here in the fender. Where is it? Right there. So we'll do 1, 2, and 3 up there. We'll get those out so that we get a movement on the fender. And you're going to want to put something over here between the running board and the fender so you don't scratch it up. Alright, so we're going to loosen up the fender. Start by taking these guys out. So again, you got to be careful with these. This car has been restored previously, so most of the stuff is not seized. If your car has never been taken apart, you got to be careful not to snap these bolts in the fender. So go easy. We're going to remove them completely. I'm going to take out the first 3 plus the running board bolt over here. Alright, and then you want to get either some tape or a rag and then put that on the fender so you don't scratch the bottom where it meets the running board. Alright, so another one out. We're going to go one more. Last one here. Alright, so we got those 3 bolts out. Take a quick peek. So that's, you got all the bolts over here and the one up here. Where is it? Somewhere there. Alright, so now your fender should be ready to move. You want to push it towards the back of the car to clear that running board, and then you want to put a rag in there so that this, sometimes these running boards have sharp edges there, so you're not scratching the fender, because you may be moving the fender as you're pulling that out. So I'm going to put a rag on there, and then we're going to drop it down. Everything we want to take apart is done. We're going to take it apart now further, but we're going to drop it down on the floor, so once this guy comes out I can support it, and I don't want to release the tension on this guy up in the air like this. I'd rather have it closer to the floor. So let's get this guy situated a bit lower, and then get that fixed up. Okay, so I got the final bolts out of here. Now it's kind of hard to see how these two rear ones come out, but let me give you an idea. So basically there's a washer on the bolt itself, and the bolt is from behind. So if you try and push out the bolt with the washer, what's going to happen is you're going to get, let's imagine this is the suspension back here, the arm like so, okay, and you've got the bolt, and for some reason they put it super close, something like that. Now as you're backing out the bolt, the washer is going to take up too much thickness to allow the bolt to continue. So you want to push the washer forward against the spring plate, and then you want to try and pull just the screw out, and you want to line up the flat part of the screw on the suspension. You don't want to have it turn so that it's the point of one of the points that's on it, because you're not going to have enough clearance. And even like this, it may be stubborn, so you want to have all the nuts loose and the bolts loose. And then what I do, I can usually get it to where it's flush in the table and it doesn't want to, on the spring plate, doesn't want to come out anymore. What I'll do is I'll get, very important, you can't put a nut anymore because it's in the spring plate. You want to get a punch, but you want the punch to be smaller than the size of your bolt, because you do not want to mushroom the end of it. And I'm not wailing away, I'm just tapping it lightly because I have no leverage. I can't get my hands back there. So you just give it 2-3 tiny taps. Just to show you, I'm using a very light body hammer because that's what I could grab quickly, and I'm barely hitting it. So you don't want to be, if you're hammering on this hard, there's something wrong. So keep an eye out for that when you're taking these bolts off. So now the next thing, this suspension is now loose, and we're ready now to raise him. I put a screwdriver here just temporary to hold it in place. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a jack stand. I'm going to raise this guy as high as I can. The part of this suspension here is going to bottom out on the framing of this suspension frame, and then we're going to unload this spring plate. So let me get the jack stand set up over here, and then we'll move on to loosening. And also I've removed the clip holding the brake line, so I have just a little bit of wiggle room depending on which way we move, so it's not as rigid as when that clip is inside back there. So it's very simple, just pull the clip out, pay attention to the direction it was in, and then you'll push the clip back in. There's a small channel in that hose fitting. So alright, let me get this jacked up on the jack stand, and then we're going to dislodge it from the spring plate. Alright, so this is where we're at. We've got the jack stand set up under the drum. I've got the suspension maxed out as high as I can. It's not going to come out completely from this double plate here, so you do not want to start chopping into this. You don't want to start yanking on this with your fingers at this point. You want to stay away from the underneath of this as much as you can right now, because we've got nothing holding this spring plate in anymore except for it being in place. We have this holding in place, the spring plate, but we don't want to depend on this. And now there's a lot of tension between this spring plate and that lower stop, like a lot of tension. So we've got the fender unbolted, we've got this guy ready, we've got a long pry bar, and what we're going to do is we're going to try to now wedge it out. I usually start a little bit from the top, a little bit from the bottom, and as it gets close to hop over this ledge, I try and get it forward from the top, so as it kicks down, it's not gonna impede on your well-being. So let's try and wiggle this guy out, see if it gives us any trouble, and then cross our fingers that everything goes well. So I'm gonna just try and get it to start. You may have to convince it from underneath a little bit. There we go. You see, so we hop it a little bit on the bottom. You want to be always careful at this point. So we're getting closer to the edge. I'll try prying. Not much on the top. So we'll continue on the bottom. Slowly. Just move the camera a bit. There we go. So now you saw it come down. The tool was a bit stuck under. That's basically all the tension, and now it let go from here as it dropped down. Now we're unloaded, but I don't trust it yet. So you want to make sure that you get in here with your tool and you try to pull it just a bit. You don't want to dislodge it from the arm, from the what's it called? From your torsion beam here. You just want to make sure that there's no residual pressure. It's not hung up on anything. And pull it out. Now this way of doing it makes it a bit easier, and I'll explain to you guys why, but there's different procedures for this. I choose to do it this way. You can choose to do it another way. There's a lot of guys online that will show you different ways of bracing this and so on. It's not necessary if you're careful and you take your time. This is not going to start flying out towards the floor, but there is about an inch or two of high pressure tension on this when it lets go, as you saw, maybe 3 inches. So you want to be away from it, and you don't want to be holding the bar. I'd rather have the bar flat of your hand than get hurt. So that's out. I'm going to make sure that it's not lodged in there anymore. It can get stuck on the splines, like it seems to be a bit. See, like it's coming a bit now. Alright, so now we're loose, and I don't know if you guys heard that on the video, I heard the rubber bushing in the back here start to let go of where it was. So now we're looking over here. It seems nice and loose. If I go and take a screwdriver, now I can see it moving in here. I'm at least a finger thickness away from this frame piece here. So now I'm out, and as you can see, I'll show you guys, with the amount that I had to move to be comfortable with it. You'll see in a second. I'll get some light. Let's see here. You'll see how close I am to the fender, and the fender's already about an inch away from the car with the end of that. So that's why you want to unbolt the fender before you get to this point. So now we've got the arm undone. You can see there's a large gap back here now. I'm going to now scribe, as many people do. I'm going to take a scribe, and I'm going to scribe a mark into here, and I'm going to scribe it enough so that it leaves a mark in the metal. We'll give it a coat of paint after, but I'll make a mark here so we have a reference if we ever want to put the car back to stock. And then I'm going to take this whole thing out. I'm going to remove the torsion bar as well. I'll show you guys that. And we're going to clean all the teeth in the torsion bar. We're going to lube up, grease up all the both ends of the torsion bar. We're going to repaint this because it looks terrible, and whoever did this left this part on primer. So we're going to grind all this off, paint it, and then we're going to clean this disaster up as well. This is all terrible. And then we're going to do the reassembly of it, except we're going to turn the we're going to turn the entire torsion bar one notch up, but we're going to index it by the inside teeth or splines, and that should give us about 2.5, a bit more than 2.5 inches of drop on this car. So let me pull this out, and then we'll show you the parts on the bench, and then we'll start cleaning this up, and then get back with the rest of it. Another super important thing when you're doing this, if you've removed the torsion bar on the suspension, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you clean up all these splines. You also want to make sure you don't bang these splines up taking it out. You can take a small screwdriver and clean out every single line over here. As you can see, there's quite a bit of crud on here, so what I'll typically do is clean each one, and then after that I'll put some fresh grease on it. I like to use marine grease since it can hold up to water. Not that this should be getting wet, but it seems to be a good all-purpose. And then just in case, if you look at the end over here, there's difference on both ends. You see the end with the dimple in it like that, that's the one that goes towards the outside. So clean that up. So the polyurethane bushings are usually a very tight fit, and I don't like it to have that much of a tight fit where it's not even going in. Right now the other part's not on here, and what tends to happen is that it's when you put this onto the spring plate, the shaft on the spring plate, that'll actually expand the inside of this slightly, so it would even be tighter. So what I like to do is I'll shave down the outside diameter of this very slightly, so that I can drop it in with just a little bit of friction, but so that we're almost flush inside this cup. And then when I do that, it allows the bushing and the cover to assemble much easier on the car. You still may need to have longer screws to compress it all together, but this allows you to install it much easier and have a less difficult time, because I find trying to install most of these bushings straight out of the box is very difficult to get lined up and to compress in. So I take a very little off. Now how do I do that? I have a bit like this with some sandpaper on it, and I find that's what works the best to take it down. Now you got to respect the angle that's on here, and again I'm just taking like, you know, barely a millimeter off of this. So there's a little tip to make reassembling this easy, and after that I'll grease up the inside and outside. We'll show you that. So you may need to do that on your poly bushing, most of the time on the IRS, and only on the outside one. So let's get this trimmed up a little bit, and then let's move on to the next step. So there you go. We've trimmed it down ever so slightly. You can see now the bushing presses in quite far into it. We're butting up pretty much in the inside, and it's still tight, like I can't pull it out with one hand, but now you're able to press it in as far as it'll go, so you'll have a much easier time getting this back on with all the other suspension components, especially since the shaft in here is going to be expanding this slightly. So now we're ready to put this on. Alright, so we're going to put the urethane bushing with the tapered end over here facing out, and there's only one way you can put this in with teeth, so you'll see the nubs over here. So we're going to press that in like so. Now you want to make sure before you put the bushing in here that all this area is cleaned out. Okay, you want to make sure this is clean, all that's clean. I've highlighted our mark over here so you guys can see it. That's our original mark. Alright, so now we've cleaned out the tube, we've got the torsion bar, we've cleaned out the splines on here. Like I started saying before, you can tell the side that goes in to the middle of the car is the side that does not have a dimple on the end, and the side that goes towards the outside has a dimple on the end. That's usually how I can tell. There's also a difference in the width of this spline here. This is narrower than the one that goes towards the middle of the car. So just in case, also the outer part of the spline will mark the side. So you'll see it'll have a left or a right. You can't mix them up, you shouldn't mix them up. So we're gonna get this torsion bar back in. What I like to do is I'm going to grease the end of it where the splines are. I usually use some marine grease for this also. You want to do this to make it easier to install, and also to keep it from corroding if at all possible. You want to keep these in perfect shape as much as possible. You want to make sure that the paint on this isn't ruined. You don't want these things rusting out. Now, again, this is where it becomes useful to have the fender off. So we're gonna try not to bounce it around too much on the way in. We're gonna get it set up inside here, and we're gonna try and find the splines, and that's it. We're in proper there. So now we have it set in. The next thing we're gonna do is I'm going to grease up the bushing, the inside of the bushing here. We'll throw that in. Again, you want to have the tapered side towards the outside, and the reason for that is that this tapered side goes against the suspension arm, and if there's any weld joints or whatever, that's what this taper is for, in my opinion. And the flat side goes towards the body, towards the middle of the car. So we're going to put this guy in, put a bit of grease on it. So that bushing is in. Now, I didn't grease the outer splines yet, just so I don't make a mess while we're doing that. So at this point, we're going to bring the spring plate, which we cleaned up the spring plate, repainted. Now, the important thing on the spring plate here is that the surface area where these bushings will ride on, you want to make sure that those are as smooth and as clean as possible. So when you take these apart, you may see some rust, you may see some scaling or something. You want to clean that up. If you're not going to repaint everything, that's up to you, but these two areas should be super clean to prolong the life of your bushings and to make the installing all this much easier. So I'm going to put a bit of grease on the spline. We're going to bring this in, and then we're going to try and adjust it so that we get back our 0 point, which is where I took it apart, and then we're going to pull out the inner spline and go up one notch to get the drop that we want on this. Also, I've cleaned out as much as I can inside here, either with a compressed air, vacuum, whatever. You want to try and get as much of the rusty or crap, whatever is in there, out. Make your life easier on the reinstall. So now again, you're going to have to pull out the fender a little bit gently. We're going to sneak this on. There you go. Okay. Hang a minute. Alright, so that was fun. The most annoying part of the whole dilemma is that pulling out and in of the spring axle, of the spring plate and the shaft itself, the torsion beam inside, torsion rod, is because if you're trying to adjust the outer and the inner spline, the problem is with these extended shaft, this particular version of the system, is that it's hard to get it to release from the external part here or the internal part, depending on which side is sticking more. So if you're trying to reposition the outside but it doesn't want to let go and it keeps pulling off from the inside, you're gonna have to play around with it and take it out to hold the actual torsion rod and move it, and then, you know, back and forth a couple of times until you get it lined up just the way you want. So now we have it lined up with the silver line over there. Let's see if we can give you a better shot of that. So you can see that we're lined up with that angle. And now, in this case, the only luck that I have, which was a pain in the ass until now, is that every time I pull this guy out, it actually comes out from the inner splines. So in our case, we want to go up one tooth on the inner spline, so it should work in our favor this time. So I'm going to pull it out just until I feel it getting to the edge of those splines on the inside, and I'm going to bring it up one notch, push it back in, and then we're going to go from there to reassemble the rest of the suspension. So let's get that lined up, and then hopefully we should have it just about 1 millimeter or 2 above the rest, so we won't have to preload this suspension again before we reinstall it or reassemble it. So now we have it up one inner notch, and I'll pull the camera there again. Now you're gonna see it's much higher up. It's actually now blocking the lower plate on that, and we're just, hard to tell here, but we're just above the rest on the plate, maybe a couple mil. So now I'm gonna finish securing some of the hardware temporarily so it kind of stays together, and then what we're gonna do is we're going to pop this part, which is now stuck behind it, over with a punch and a pry bar so that it hops over, and so that we can then press the suspension back together. Okay, so now I'm going to press on the outer bushing. Again, your tapered wall towards the inside, so that if you've got this bead over here, this weld bead or whatever, it fits into that taper. I'll usually put a bit of grease on the actual suspension, a little bit of grease on the bushing so it slides on. We'll have to wipe the excess off after. Alright, that's on. Perfect. Now a trick that I'll do will be to get some longer bolts, and I'll put a description, or the size in the description of the bolts I use on this. Because everything is brand new, everything's a little wider as you're assembling it until you compress everything together and it has a chance to work in. So what I do is I get the same size bolt, obviously same millimeter, same thread pitch and everything, and then we're going to use those to pull everything together for us until everything's seated in the right place. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the cover. Go, just like so. Perfect. And then we're going to try and get all this to go together. I'm going to wipe off that excess grease. Now the next thing we're going to do is get ready to hop over this suspension. So let me get the tools ready for that. So now what I'm going to do is I have a large punch, and I want to try to wiggle this plate down and under that suspension part. So you can use a small screwdriver, and then I want to work the other one in there, so I may have to put the screwdriver there, and we're gonna try and hop it over like so. Okay. And just gently pry the suspension down. This is probably one of the shittier parts of this. There you go. So we just pried it down and over, and now it's almost in. It just needs a little push on the inside like that. See? So again, long tools. Keep your fingers out of there. Or don't and end up with problems. So, word of warning, you see it, so be careful. So now we've hopped it over. Now our suspension plate is inwards, and I've also, before I started that, let's just grab this out of here. What I did is I took my longer bolts and I put one in the front position here, which is the worst one to put in. So I start with that guy, get it in a few threads. I get this guy in here, and because I've reduced by about 1 millimeter, or maybe a bit less, the circumference of the bushing in here, everything went together nice and tight, but not overly tight so that I'm fighting it. So now everything fit together nicely. Again, the bushings are still tight in here, except it doesn't want to push itself out. If your bushings are overly tight, you're going to see the urethane bushings, you press it in, and it by itself is going to want to slide out because it's being compressed too much. So that's together. I have the bottom bolt screwed in, at least 3 or 4 threads, the top one with a couple of threads. I've hopped this guy over. Now he's back inside the channel because it's a dual channel type of arm. We're back in. We have a slight millimeter gap here, which is exactly the same as on the other side. So now we're even with both sides, which means we've moved our splines the same amount, which means the car should be straight when we put it back together. I've hopped this over now. Now I can remove my jack stand here and then drop the suspension down. I put a bit of grease on here so that when it's bolted together, it's not going to rust together so much as they usually do. And now what I want to do here is I can tighten these screws a little bit and then bring this plate in enough to get the factory screws in here, and then tighten this plate down, and then drop this guy down and start putting those bolts in. So let's get these bolts in, and then let's pull this back down and together on that. So as you can see, this is, where is it? There we go. So this is the bolt that I used to pull everything together, and that's the length of the factory bolt. So it's not a lot, but it's enough just to cause you a lot of headaches. So I'm going to pull in those 2 bolts that we put in, and then we'll be able to start putting the factory bolts back in. Usually what I like to do on this, or maybe tempted to use an air tool, always make sure that the threads are going in smoothly. Once you do that, you can go and use an air tool or electric ratchet or something, but you don't want to go and use that right off the bat in case you're cross-threading something and you may not notice using an air tool or an electric tool. So let's get this in. Alright, so we've closed the gap about half the distance that we had. Now I'm going to check and see if these bolts will line up. And now we've got the room to get that thread in. So I like to put a little bit of anti-seize on here. You've also got a lock washer that's on this. So I'll get this guy started over here. Again, before I put it, once everything's apart, what I like to do is to clean all the threads on the bolts. You want to run a wire brush or whatever means you have, a hand brush, whatever you have available. You want to clean these up. If the threads are damaged, you want to fix that. And you may also want to run a spare bolt or a thread chaser through the holes on the frame to make sure that the holes are nice and clean, so that when it comes time to reassemble, you're not fighting because the threads on the frame are no good, or damaged, and now you're stuck doing it with all this stuff in place. So always double check the threads on your car when you're doing work, to make sure that it's not complicated for nothing after. Alright, so we'll get these screws in. I like to start them all by hand. There you go. Get those on and then move on to dropping down the other one. So let's tighten that up and then bring down the swing axle here. Alright, so these 4 bolts are tight. With the original bolts, you only want to tighten them up. There's a little spacer on that plate. You want to tighten it up till it's tight. You don't want to go absolutely bananas on that. Now I'm going to just lift up this the drum, and we're going to remove the jack from here. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to lower this suspension arm down like so. Usually it won't fall down too quickly, so you don't have to get stressed about lowering this down. You want to make sure you're not binding on your axle shaft, which should be tied away, which ours is. Now if you want to, you can bang it down a little bit until it goes by that, and even like that you've got enough resistance in the bushing to hold it there. Now the first bolt I usually put in just temporarily, you could put, is this smaller bolt that goes in the front. I just thread it in slowly. Now you want to also pay attention, you've got a thick washer and a thin lock washer, at least we have on this car. So the way you usually want to do that, and this is like kind of like a wobble to some extent, like a crooked type of lock washer. So I put the lock washer towards the bolt and then the thicker one after towards the car, and on this one we'll screw in over here. So we'll get that set in here temporarily like so, just to hold it there, a couple of turns. Now comes the fun part of reinstalling the bolts that you removed from the backside. Now we've again cleaned up these bolts. You want to use some thread chasers to clean up the threads in the nuts, the threads on the bolts, and again you're going to have now one washer on the backside with the nut, and then you'll have the lock washer and the thicker washer. So thick washer, lock washer, nut, and then a washer on the back side of this, and the bolts will be facing from the transmission towards the tire, so that you're putting the nuts on from this side. So we'll push through that. The easiest one to do is the center one, and then you'll have to fiddle around to get the 2 others in. I'm going to put a tiny bit of anti-seize on this, on these bolts, just so that to keep it from corroding a little bit and from seizing up. So we'll go with the middle one, pop that guy through, then we'll go thick washer, lock washer, and then the nut. Just like so. Alright, you don't want to go too tight on that. Now the next thing we're going to do is we got to now thread in the other bolts from the back side, and if you recall in the beginning, we'll now have to get the washer closer to the table or to the arm, and then we got to push through the bolt, because if you try and push it through like this, the thickness of the washer here together with the head of the bolt will not allow you to pass that trailing arm. So you want to have it kind of set up like this, where you're feeding the washer close to the table or to the plate, the spring plate, and then you're going to push the washer in, and you also have to pay attention so that this side of the bolt is kind of resting flat against the suspension arm. You're not on a point, because it'll never go in. So I'm going to put a bit of anti-seize on this guy as well. Alright. And now we're going to hope for the best. So I have the washer in, and then it goes in just as simple as that. We'll do it again with the next one. Again, I'll put a little bit of anti-seize on it. Put it in from behind. Bring the washer close by. And there you go, you're through. Okay? Now we're going to close up the end over there with the proper washers and nuts. So, to reiterate, thick washer, thin washer, followed by the nut. And then again, same thing. Thick washer, thin washer, followed by the nut. Thick washer, thin one, and the nut. So there you go. So now we're ready to put the shock in next. But before you do that, if you want at this point, you have two options. We have the original score marks on the table, on the spring here, spring plate that I could see. We can line it up. I also took a note of where it was in the slots on the table here, so I can pull this out. And then if you'll see, they're slotted. Okay. Now on this car, it was a little bit, it was more or less centered, a touch to the back. Ideally, you go get an alignment after you do something like this. But in the meantime, you can try and put it back to where it was. I'm going to center this one in the middle, and then we'll get this one aligned at a later date. So, but if you want to on your end, if you're doing this kind of job and putting everything back to stock, if you're just changing bushings, which is pretty much the same procedure, you want to put maybe a mark, a notch, or something to mark your slotted holes so that you can put it back to where it was. So we're going to line that up. I'm going to tighten these down. I couldn't find a torque spec for these, so I'm going to torque them around 60-70 foot-pounds, and then we're going to put the shock back in. So let's get that torqued up, and then we'll start putting the rest of the stuff back on. All right, so now I'm going to put back my spring clip into the brakes, the brake line. That spring clip is back in. Now we're ready to put our shock back in. So tighten that down, and then the next thing we're going to do is then install the bump stop that we cut down. So we've got the bump stop. We took 1 inch off the top, and we're just going to press it back in. I put a tiny bit of grease on the inside over here just to make it easier to pop it into place, just like so. Make sure it stays there. So that's in. Now just going to tighten down the shock, and then the last thing on this setup here will be to double check our work and then install the axle back onto the axle flange. So let me just tighten up the shock, and then we'll put the axle back on. Alright, so now we're going to put the axle back on. So we can undo our strap over here, like so. Drop that down. Now you can repack the CV joint at this point if you want to add a bit of grease on it. I'm not going to, because these boots are shot. We're going to change those shortly. I'm just going to reassemble this to take a look at the car on the ground, and also to show you guys the result, and then we'll work on these axles afterwards. So let me get these guys back in. Again, it's a hex head. You always want to start these by hand as much as possible if you can. You do not want a situation where you cross thread things just to save a minute or two, because in the end it's going to cost you more time than you thought you were saving. So we're going to take our handy hex socket on the ratchet, and then we're going to tighten these guys down. So now this is the last part we need to reinstall to complete the suspension. The only thing left now is going to be to reinstall the fender bolts along the inside, put back the fender bead, reinstall the bolt on the running board, and then we're going to drop this guy down and take a look at how it sits. We do know that right now both sides are clocked exactly the same, so the ride height should be identical. So I'm going to button up this axle and then we're going to take a look at it on the ground.